Imagine standing in front of Stonehenge. You're looking at 2-ton stones dragged from mountains over 150 miles away. You're looking at astronomical precision that took generations to plan. And for thousands of years, we had absolutely no idea who built it. We had theories, myths, legends, but no faces. No names, no origins until now. Because scientists just extracted DNA from the bones buried beneath Stonehenge, and what they found has completely rewritten the history of ancient Britain. These people don't match any living population on Earth today. They're not the ancestors of modern British people. They're not even close relatives of anyone we know today. So who were they? Where did they come from? And what happened to them? Buckle up, because this story goes back over 5,000 years. And it's stranger than anything you've ever read in a history book. Let's start with the basics. Stonehenge wasn't built in a day. Most people think of it as one monument, but it's actually the result of multiple construction phases spanning more than 1,000 years. The earliest phase began around 3000 BCE, that's 5,000 years ago. The massive sarsen stones, the ones that form those iconic arches you see in every photo, those were put in place around 2500 BCE. So the question of who built Stonehenge isn't really a single question. Different groups of people were involved at different times. And the DNA evidence has now given us a window into who those earliest builders actually were. In 2019, a landmark study published in Nature Ecology and Evolution analyzed the ancient DNA of 51 individuals buried in and around Stonehenge. These were people who lived in Britain during the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, roughly between 4000 and 2500 BCE. This was the era of Stonehenge's construction. These were, quite literally, the people who built it. And here's where things get fascinating. When the researchers compared this ancient DNA to modern populations, they found something completely unexpected. The genetic profile of these Stonehenge builders is largely absent from the modern British population. If you're British, you're probably thinking, wait, shouldn't these be my ancestors? The answer, surprisingly, is not really. The Stonehenge builders were descended from a population of early European farmers who originated in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. These people migrated into Europe starting around 6000 BCE, bringing agriculture with them. They spread across the continent, reached Britain around 4000 BCE, and then, over the following centuries, they built Stonehenge. But here's the twist. About the same time the later stages of Stonehenge were being completed, a massive migration from the Eurasian steppe began. These were the Yamnaya people, pastoral herders from what is now Russia and Ukraine. They had horses. They had wheels. They had a genetic profile completely different from the Anatolian farmers. And when they arrived in Britain, around 2500 to 2000 BCE, they didn't just settle alongside the existing population. They almost completely replaced it. Within a few generations, the genetic signature of the Stonehenge builders had been reduced to near zero in the British Isles. It's one of the most dramatic population replacements in prehistoric European history. Think about that for a moment. The people who built one of the most iconic monuments in human history were essentially erased. Not just culturally, not just politically, genetically. Their DNA, which had been the dominant genetic heritage in Britain for thousands of years, just vanished. And we had no idea this happened until we could sequence ancient DNA. Now, let's talk about what we actually know about these people. Because they weren't just builders. They had a full, rich civilization, and the evidence from Stonehenge and surrounding sites tells us a lot about who they were. These Neolithic farmers were a sophisticated society. They practiced agriculture, raising cattle and growing grain. They built communal long barrows, massive earthen burial mounds, which shows us that they had a strong sense of community and an elaborate belief system around death. They traded goods across hundreds of miles. They were, by any reasonable definition, a complex civilization, and they were obsessed with the dead. One of the most striking things about Stonehenge is that it was primarily a burial site. Archaeologists have found the cremated remains of at least 58 individuals at Stonehenge, spanning about 500 years of use. These weren't random people. The isotope analysis suggests many of them came from far away, possibly Wales, possibly other distant regions of Britain. Stonehenge was a place where the community's most important members were brought to rest, possibly from across a wide geographic area. The DNA analysis added another layer to this. Several of the individuals buried at Stonehenge showed signs of being closely related: brothers, parents, and children. This suggests that certain elite lineages had a privileged connection to the monument. It wasn't just a public burial ground, it was the resting place of a hereditary elite. Which raises the question, what kind of society were these people living in? Were they egalitarian? Hierarchical? The evidence points towards something in between. There are burials with more elaborate grave goods suggesting status differences. But there's also no evidence of the extreme wealth concentration you see in later Bronze Age societies. It was a world in transition, complex enough to organize the construction of Stonehenge, but not yet fully stratified in the way that later civilizations would be. Now let's talk about the actual construction, because this is where things get mind-blowing. The blue stones at Stonehenge, the smaller stones in the inner circle, were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales. That's 150 miles away, across rivers, hills, and the Severn estuary, with no wheels, no horses, no metal tools. Just human muscle, wooden sleds, and an extraordinary level of social organization. How do we know where they came from? Geology. The specific type of spotted dolerite found at Stonehenge is unique to a single outcrop in Wales. And recently, archaeologists have actually found the quarry sites, places where you can see the scars left by the removal of the stones, and even some partially extracted stones still in the ground. The quarry sites show evidence of human activity around 3400 BCE, which means the blue stones were being extracted and transported centuries before the Sarsen Circle was built. Why bring stones from so far away when there are perfectly good rocks locally? This is one of the biggest mysteries. Some researchers think the blue stones were already sacred, that they had been part of an earlier monument in Wales, possibly a healing shrine, and were deliberately relocated to their new home. There's actually evidence for a dismantled stone circle in Wales that may have been the origin of the Stonehenge blue stones. The Sarsen stones are a different story. They weigh up to 25 tons each, and they came from Marlborough Downs about 25 miles away. The logistics of moving them are staggering. Experiments have shown it takes hundreds of people working together to haul even one of these stones on a wooden sledge. And yet the builders didn't just move them, they shaped them with extraordinary precision, using stone hammers to create the mortise and tenon joints that lock the uprights to the lintels. That's a carpentry technique in stone, 5,000 years ago. The precision of the construction, combined with its astronomical alignment. The monument is perfectly aligned with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, tells us that these builders had sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, engineering, and mathematics. This wasn't a primitive culture. These were highly intelligent, technically capable people with a deep understanding of the natural world. So what happened to them? This is where the story gets dark. The Yamnaya migration, sometimes called the Beaker folk, after the distinctive pottery they brought with them, represents one of the most dramatic demographic events in European prehistory. The latest genetic studies suggest that within just a few centuries of their arrival in Britain, the Neolithic farmer population had been reduced to less than 10% of what it had been. This wasn't gradual assimilation, it was replacement, rapid, thorough replacement. What caused it? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain. But the leading hypotheses include plague, violence, and a combination of both. The Yamnaya carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. Ancient DNA analysis has found evidence of this pathogen in Yamnaya skeletons from the steppe. When they moved into Europe, they may have brought an epidemic with them that devastated populations that had no immunity. Similar to what happened when Europeans arrived in the Americas thousands of years later. Some researchers also point to evidence of conflict. Some Neolithic sites show signs of violence, skeletal trauma, burned settlements. The transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age in Britain was not peaceful everywhere. And then there's a subtler but perhaps more powerful force: reproductive advantage. If the Yamnaya were slightly more mobile, slightly better fed, slightly more resistant to certain diseases, they could have outcompeted the existing population over generations without any deliberate violence at all. The truth is probably some combination of all three. And the result was that the Stonehenge builders, this remarkable civilization that had transformed the British landscape over 2,000 years, effectively disappeared. Their monuments remained, their DNA did not. What makes this so poignant is how recent this discovery is. For centuries, we looked at Stonehenge and assumed some kind of continuity, that the monument was connected to the ancestors of the people who lived near it later. The Druids who performed ceremonies at Stonehenge in historical times were Celtic, part of the Bronze and Iron Age cultures that came much later. They had no genetic or cultural connection to the original builders. When modern Druids stand at Stonehenge today, they're honoring a monument built by a people who are strangers to them in every measurable sense. There's something both sad and awe-inspiring about that. Stonehenge outlasted its builders by thousands of years. It became sacred to people who came after, people who had replaced the original population. The monument transcended its creators. Now, there's one more piece of this puzzle that's worth discussing, because it complicates the picture in an interesting way. Not all of Britain was replaced equally. In Western Britain, particularly in Wales and Scotland, there's more genetic continuity with the Neolithic farmers than in England. The Yamnaya replacement was most complete in the southeast, which makes geographic sense. That's where they entered and where they were most densely settled. This means that some descendants of the Stonehenge builders may still exist today, particularly among people with ancient Welsh or Scottish ancestry. The genes didn't completely vanish, they just became a tiny fraction of the modern British gene pool. And the Anatolian farmer ancestry that the Stonehenge builders carried, it's still present throughout Europe, including Britain. It's just diluted by thousands of years of subsequent migration. Every European carries some of it. So in a very literal genetic sense, we are all, to some small degree, descendants of people like the Stonehenge builders. The study of ancient DNA has transformed archaeology over the past decade, and Stonehenge is one of the most dramatic examples of what this technology can reveal. Before ancient DNA, we had to infer population movements from artifacts, pottery styles, tool types, burial customs. Those things can tell you about cultural transmission, but culture can spread without people moving. Genes can't. When the DNA tells you a population was replaced, you know it actually happened, and the implications go beyond Stonehenge. All across Europe, ancient DNA is revealing a history of population movement and replacement that was completely invisible to previous generations of researchers. The people who built the megalithic monuments of Ireland, France, Spain, and Scandinavia were all part of the same Anatolian farmer expansion, and all of them were largely replaced by the same steppe migration. This is the hidden history of Europe, not the history of great empires and famous names, but the deeper story of populations rising, spreading, and being replaced, leaving monuments behind as ghostly traces of civilizations that no living person directly remembers. Stonehenge is the most spectacular of those traces. But now for the first time we can put faces, or at least DNA sequences, to the hands that raised those stones. We know these were dark-haired, dark-eyed people, genetically similar to modern Sardinians, who are another population that preserved a large amount of Anatolian farmer ancestry. They were farmers, they were ritualists, they were astronomers and engineers. They were connected to communities across Britain and possibly beyond. And they had a profound relationship with their dead that drove them to create one of the most complex and enduring monuments in human history. We don't know their language. We don't know the name they called themselves. We don't know their myths, or their prayers, or the songs they sang while hauling stones across the landscape. That knowledge died with them 5,000 years ago, but we know their DNA, and that's something. Every new generation of technology gives us another layer of access to the past. Radiocarbon dating told us when Stonehenge was built. Geology told us where the stones came from. Isotope analysis told us where the people buried there had traveled in their lifetimes. And now ancient DNA has told us who those people were at the deepest biological level and what happened to them. The story isn't finished. New studies are published every year. Every new burial site, every new ancient genome adds another data point to the picture. Scientists are currently working to understand not just who these people were, but how the replacement happened, the timing, the mechanism, the regional variations. Future research may even recover DNA from the cremated remains at Stonehenge itself, which would be an unprecedented achievement given how challenging it is to extract DNA from burned bone. And beyond DNA, there are other mysteries still unsolved. Why did the construction phases of Stonehenge shift over time? What changed in the religious or social function of the site? Why was it eventually abandoned around 1500 BCE? These are questions that genetics alone can't answer. But here's what we do know. 5,000 years ago, a remarkable people undertook an extraordinary project. They moved mountains, literally, to honor their dead and mark the passage of the sun. They built something that has outlasted every civilization that came after them. And when their civilization fell, swallowed by migrations and disease, and the turning of history, the monument they built remained. Stonehenge stands today not as a mystery but as a message from a lost people to a future they couldn't have imagined, a message that says we were here, we mattered. We looked at the sky and found meaning in it. We carried these stones so that something of us would last. And 5,000 years later, we're finally beginning to understand who sent that message. If this kind of deep history storytelling is something you want more of, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week I go into the science behind the world's greatest mysteries, not just the surface story, but the actual research, the evidence, the debates among scientists. If you found this fascinating, drop a comment below. I want to know what surprised you most. Was it the population replacement, the Welsh origins of the stones, the fact that these builders genetically resemble modern Sardinians? Tell me. And share this video with someone who loves history. Because most people have no idea any of this happened, and they should.